Okay, so that was Bill, and talking about his paper. And so Nick and I were invited to write a paper for the anniversary issue that discussed the contribution of too slow or not too slow. And we do that in the first part of the paper, but I don't think I need to do that now because Bill has talked about that in his video, and he is, of course, the greatest authority on his contribution in that paper. And what I want to talk about today is the rest of our paper, which tries to analyse the legacy of too slow or not too slow. And in particular, we identify the legacy of that paper as being Nordhaus's later generation of so-called DICE models, these dynamic models of economic growth and climate change. And Bill has published several versions of these models, and usually the result he comes up with is that the optimal climate policy for a benevolent social planner at the global level is a modest price on carbon, which is modestly increasing over time. And on the other hand, it's fairly well known that when Nick Stern published his review on the economics of climate change in 2006, he recommended a large price on carbon immediately and increasing. While Bill has published some work which might suggest that given certain alternative assumptions, the optimal carbon price is higher, I think it's fair to say that across the economics community as a whole, this is the impression that is generally held. Nordhaus goes for modest controls, Stern for strong controls, and importantly, what separates them is their positions on the discount rate. So one of the main things that we try to do in this paper is to show that there are other things that you can do to develop Bill's modelling framework which will lead to the conclusion that the optimal controls are large and rising that do not depend on a low discount rate. In fact, for all of the following analysis, we'll stick with Bill Nordhaus's standard discount rate. Okay. And this is where a paper from a couple of years ago by Nick, which was published in the Journal of Economic Literature, comes in. This was a think piece, really, a review containing some ideas. And in it, he argued that integrated assessment models, as exemplified by DICE, graphed gross underestimation of risk onto already narrow science models. I guess that was what Bill was referring to when he said he had first mover disadvantage by not being here. But that's what Nick wrote. And in particular, he said that there are very strong grounds for arguing that integrated assessment models grossly underestimate the risks of climate change. And there were three or four related grounds. I'm going to expand on these in just a moment, so I'll just lay them out here for you right now. Firstly, that models like DICE are based on a sort of solo Cass-Koopmans growth model with one sector and exogenous total factor productivity, so a sort of solo residual driving long-run growth. You add to that damage functions linking climate change with the economy, which work only on annual output, so not on the long-run drivers of growth, not on capital, not on productivity. What Nick considered to be quantitatively weak damage functions and very limited distributions of risk, meaning, in particular, he was referring to risk of the climate system behaving in an undesirable way from a social point of view. Let me take just a moment to actually expand on what these mean. So you can flesh out this by just looking at the standard DICE model. So this is the production function in DICE. So this is a global single good model. Production is Cobb-Douglas with a solo residual. Okay? And that is the A, which is total factor productivity, just grows at some exogenous rate. And the rate of growth falls. So it sort of leads to secular stagnation, but only in the very long run. Now, climate change comes along and essentially drives a wedge between the output that you could potentially achieve given the factors of production that you have and the productivity level you enjoy and the actual production you achieve. This thing, 1 minus d hat, is the so-called damage multiplier. The best analogy for this is something like crop loss. Okay, so you've got your barns, your tractors, your seeds, you lay out, plant everything, and then at some time just before the harvest, along comes some lousy weather, and you lose a portion of the crop. And that's the kind of best analogy for this kind of model of climate damages. The damage multiplier itself is a quadratic function, right? It deserves to be stressed that this is absolutely the industry standard model of aggregate climate damages. So most macro models of climate change work with this kind of damage function. And clearly it depends on what parameter values you set. All the action is on the quadratic term, and the point is with a coefficient like this, you basically get modest damages. Now that's not such a problem when you're talking about a couple of degrees of global warming, because ultimately this is a reduced form relationship. It's a curve that's fitted on data, and we have some data points for a couple of degrees of global warming. So we think that this function is reasonably well constrained by data for low amounts of warming. Where the argument starts is what happens when the planet heats up 4, 5, 6, 10 degrees more than it is now. And it has been suggested by people like Marty Weitzman that a quadratic function is implausible in that setting. It's been famously shown that you have to get to 18 degrees of global warming to lose half of the planet's economic output. And of course, at 18 degrees of global warming, we look more like Venus than planet Earth. Indeed, 5 degrees is roughly the difference between today and the peak of the last ice age, when everything north of Watford was under about 4 miles of ice. Okay, so we're talking about substantial environmental changes. Temperature in Dietz is a complex function of emissions, so it's not worth me trying to write down the state equation. But one thing to emphasize is that a key parameter in integrated assessment models is climate sensitivity, which basically describes how much the planet warms for a doubling in the atmospheric stock of greenhouse gases from just before the Industrial Revolution. And most of the times Dietz is run, it's with a best estimate of 3 degrees centigrade. And I'll show you in a minute. I'll show in a minute what the climate science community thinks of that as an estimate. Okay, so we want to sort of, building on that structure, we want to try to build into the Dietz model formally some of the arguments that Nick put in his JEL piece from 2013. So we're going to expand the model of production to think about some fairly standard ideas of endogenous growth. We are going to apportion some fraction of climate damages to the drivers of long-run growth, right? So we're going to have damages, some portion of damages on capital or on total factor productivity rather than merely on annual output. We are going to look at some recent ideas, for example, from Marty Weitzman on the damage function having a higher order term, which drives sort of tipping point style. I mean, it's going to be a continuous function, but generally speaking, tipping point style damages at some amount of warming. And we are going to look at that climate sensitivity parameter in a setting where it has a probability distribution associated with it, which is representative of the latest science. Okay. I'll probably go pretty quickly through these things, but just to give you a sense of what we do on growth. So we lean on the sort of Arrow-Romer type model of learning by doing, where growth is partly endogenous, because knowledge depends on the stock of capital. So practically, the difference that's going to be made here is that there's going to be an additional term which describes the elasticity of output with respect to capital, which is a beta, which describes the fact that when, this is for a one good social planner model, but if you would think about this at the level of firms, this can be derived from a model where firms accumulate capital and they also create a positive externality in the form of knowledge across the whole economy when they do so, just like Paul Romer's model. And we've got damages, we've got some portion of damages working on output as before, but we also allow some portion of climate damages to affect capital accumulation. So we're saying that, in effect, climate change increases the depreciation of capital because, for instance, weather shocks destroy coastal defences and productive infrastructure. We have it, to keep things simple, we have exogenous savings, so SY is just investment, and this is standard depreciation. And we, as I said, we, in order to sort of do a controlled comparison with the standard model, we partition overall damages in standard DICE into damages on output, DY, and damages on capital, DK. Now, one of the problems with a model like this is that from the point of view of knowledge accumulation and depreciation, the fact that knowledge is in one-for-one correspondence with the capital stock means that knowledge, economy-wide knowledge, I mean, is going to depreciate just as fast as the capital stock. Okay? And so if we make a standard assumption that capital depreciation is 10% a year, then we're going to have a very significant rate of depreciation also on knowledge, probably an implausible rate of depreciation on economy-wide knowledge. So we also suggest an alternative model of endogenous growth, which is also based on the idea of learning by doing, and does it a different way, though. So we go back to a standard model of production. We have standard capital dynamics, but we have endogenous TFP. So TFP becomes an endogenous state variable. It is accumulated, it depreciates, or it may depreciate. This, you best interpret this term as net depreciation. This is exogenous, and it could be a negative parameter to represent exogenous accumulation of knowledge. Instead of having the accumulation of knowledge proportional to capital, we have it as a function of the flow of investment instead. Okay, so this is, you could think of this as like a spillovers function, which converts the flow of investment by firms into accumulation of total factor productivity. And importantly, we have damages on productivity, right? So this sort of captures the idea that things like water supply infrastructure, for instance, may become less productive as a result of climatic changes, which takes this infrastructure away from the conditions in which it was designed to operate. And we partition damages as before. A note on the instantaneous damage function then, the thing that gets partitioned. So here we build on a paper by Marty Weitzman in the Journal of Public Economic Theory 2012. He argues that we should add, I mean, frankly speaking, based on his priors, because we really, what a key feature of this whole argument about damages is we really don't have any useful data to constrain this function in the range where we're having the argument. So Marty says, I think it's fair to say, I think, being Marty, I think the damage function is more like this. It has a higher order term. So this gives rise to three scenarios in our paper. The standard one, where of course if we set pi3 equal to 0, we just go back to the quadratic function. The function that Marty suggested, which is parameterized so that you lose 50% of global output at 6 degrees of warming. And what we call a high scenario, which loses 50% of global output at 4 degrees of warming. This is really inspired by the fact that I think if you talk to the majority of the science community, they would consider the tipping point to lie not at 6 degrees, but more like at 4 degrees. And there are several key publications in climate science which could be taken to imply that. But I hope you take this work in the spirit in which it is intended. I would call this quasi-empirical at best. But we are all doing things that are quasi-empirical on this topic. Lastly, climate sensitivity. Remember I said to you that the approach in standard DICE is to take a climate sensitivity of 3 degrees. It turns out that 3 degrees is, to a first approximation, perfectly close to the mean of a distribution which I've fitted on IPCC data. So Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change summarizes the consensus knowledge of thousands of scientists about climate sensitivity and many other things every few years. Their consensus statements in 2013 can be represented by a distribution like this. The key feature of it, though, the key features of it is that it has a very large breadth and it has a significant skew. And one of the new entrants to the climate debate in recent years has been discussion about what is the significance to the whole story of this stuff down here, this non-negligible probability of extremely large climate sensitivity. Okay? So in our paper, sometimes we just run our model for different point values, 1.5, 3, and 6, but we also run it in a stochastic setting using this distribution. So I'll show you some results. Top line is standard DICE. This is consumption global. This is consumption per capita of the global average person over the next 200 years in standard DICE. And you can see really that at the heart of the traditional sort of discounting trade-off, the fact that we will be much, about something like an order of 10 or 15 better off in a couple of hundred years' time than we are today, even after you've taken climate change into consideration. Next line down is what happens if we take the same instantaneous level of damages and just start incorporating endogenous growth into the equation. These results are for our TFP model. They look similar for our model of capital destruction. Okay, so it doesn't look like it makes a big difference to the overall picture, but in a moment when I show you optimal carbon prices, you'll see that it is a non-trivial effect when measured on that domain. This line is what happens when you switch from Nordhaus's quadratic function to Marty-Weitzman's function. This line, the green one, is what happens when you switch to the high damage function. And the blue line is Marty's damage function with a high climate sensitivity of 6 degrees. And so, you know, in broad terms, you can see that were assumptions such as these to turn out to be true, then climate change has the potential at some point to drive the planet into a sort of growth equivalent recession, okay? And depress living standards back down to levels that we have around now. I'll probably skip optimal emissions cuts and instead just show you optimal carbon prices. So this is the result of standard DICE. So this is if we were to introduce a globally harmonized carbon tax this year, or a globally comprehensive cap and trade scheme with tradable carbon permits, we should have a price on a permit or a tax rate of $44 a ton of carbon. This is more usually expressed in terms of dollars a ton of CO2, whereupon you should divide, if I also take into consideration inflation from the base year of DICE, because these are, I think, 2005 prices, I think you should divide by about 3.1 if you want to think about it in terms of current dollars per ton of CO2, okay? So that's, you know, we're talking about sort of $13, $14 a ton of CO2, okay? If all we do is, if all we change is we introduce consensus scientific knowledge on the climate sensitivity and reapportion standard damages between output and long-run drivers of growth, we increase that optimal initial carbon price by about a factor of 3, okay? If we think that higher damage functions better describe what the future consequences of climate change will be, then obviously this number is much higher again. I mean, you know, you take this number with a pinch of salt, obviously, also because models like DICE don't have any particular barriers to decarbonisation, right? So it's assumed that you can optimally immediately introduce a carbon price of about this level, but clearly in reality, I mean, if you want to seriously think about what the optimal carbon price is in a world described by high damages, you would also want to think about how quickly you can optimally introduce these kind of controls. So just to conclude, So one of the aims in our companion paper was to explore necessary and sufficient conditions to sustain deep emissions cuts at the optimum, and at the same time examine the proposition that standard dice might grossly underestimate climate risks to the economy for the reasons that Nick set out. And we've tried to show that if you buy into the changes that we make to the model, and of course you're quite entitled not to do so, then you can sustain deep optimal cuts in carbon emissions even with a high discount rate. So that's it really. I'm chairing myself here, so I better be careful not to push my luck. But I think given that the other two papers are quite different, I suggest that if there are any questions, I take just a couple now and then hand over to Rick for the next talk. So are there a couple of questions that we could take at this stage? Okay, doesn't look like there are. That makes life, sorry, yes.
So on these things, what kind of parts per million are we ending at?
Oh, I've got some data on that, so some results. So I just didn't show it. So this is standard dice. You've got an atmospheric concentration of CO2 only of 700 parts per million by the end of the century. So you add another 50, 100 for all greenhouse gases. On the optimal runs with our, that's optimal. With our various additions, you're talking more in the range of 450 to 500 ppm. So that tends to be more in line with what the scientists, what the community of scientists would like us to be, where they would like us to be, I think is fair to say. Yes?
Why do you have so much preoccupation, even though recent research seems to suggest that it's not just mean global temperature, it's also volatility.
Yes.
And that doesn't seem to figure into your damage things. They're just a function of this single variable. And
Yes.
you would think that we need to incorporate that other notion, which can cause a lot
Yes.
of damage, of course.
No, you're quite right about that. I mean, we're working in a tradition here which thinks about the long-run change in the average temperature rather than the volatility around that. But of course, the volatility around that is also important. So I don't deny that. We just work it in that tradition. Simple as that, really. You're right. I think in fairness to the schedule and not extending my privilege too much, we should move on. So the next talk is by Professor Rick van der Ploeg from the University of Oxford, where he's Professor of Economics and Research Director of the Centre for the Analysis of Resource-Rich Economies.
Yeah, fair enough.
Fair enough, he says. His talk is going to be on climate tipping and economic growth. And Rick, I will give you the lapel mic.
But you will detach it, will you? Yeah.
I will detach it, so I don't have to follow you around. No.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Is it on? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for asking me. This is nothing as complicated as what either Nordhaus has done or what Simon has just done. It's a little Mickey Mouse story, and it's more conceptual. I've got some numbers in it. But it's about one of the things which Bill Nordhaus mentioned himself, and that's the idea that we really should take account of climate tipping as well. So really most of the damages which Simon has talked about and which Nordhaus talked about and most people talk about are gradual damages. Temperature goes up a little bit and then you eat a bit of production, doesn't materialize, so you get some production damages. So this is more about, and I want to talk about this just briefly because I think it changes the nature of the type of adjustments we need to do in the economy. If you just have gradual damages, and it is all very first best, there's only one market which is missing, it's the market for CO2. And you just charge a price for it. And Simon has just given an example of damages are more convex and a bit more extreme, you get higher prices and it's quite big potatoes. Here I'm trying to argue a conceptually different thing. Yeah, we need to price carbon, but we may also need to have something to do with precaution. It's very important to have precaution over, and you need something else apart from taxation. So you may need some carbon tax, you need some carbon pricing, but you also need to have some precautionary capital accumulation. If that's the only thing you remember, I'm happy. So the idea is we have, I mean, like Simon and many of the people follow a tradition that we say that, and there's a paper by Golosov in Econometrica and co-authors, and they just say there's a probability, small probability, say 6%, that we get a catastrophic damage, and then they proceed to use the expected damages. Here I'm trying to argue there's a chance that you might really tip and something terrible might happen. For example, the Gulf Stream may reverse, or we may get a sudden release, well, a gradual release, I should say, of permafrost. And the point is that a hazard of such a catastrophe actually increases with temperature. So if we have more global warming, we get screwed possibly because it brings forward the possibility of these catastrophes. So that's really what climate scientists are looking at, and particularly thinking of Lenton and other people like that. I'm not the first to look at this, definitely not, but I think it's nice. I think I'm trying to put these two ways of looking at this: carbon tax, carbon pricing, and capital accumulation. The loads of catastrophes, and although I could talk about them and I have more detailed models, I'm going to give you a toy model. And then we can maybe, I could have talked about numerical stuff, but I wanted to show you the insight. So here are some examples of the catastrophes that might occur. I'm going to assume that the impact is immediate, but of course if you do numerical work, sometimes the impact is much more gradual. It may take hundreds of years before it to happen. So previous work, the guy who's worked mostly on uncertainty and precautionary stuff is Christian Gollier from Toulouse, but he is always done in very stylized models, and it's really precaution arriving from a third derivative of the utility function being positive. So it's related to that. There's Baumier, who is also an uncertainty theorist, basically has a doomsday scenario. So some of this catastrophe literature just says a catastrophe happens and that's the end of the world. So they have a Jehovah's Witness type of theory of climate change. And I think what we'll have a shock, and maybe you get 20%, 30 or 50% drop in output, and then the life continues, so you can recover from it. But this doomsday scenario has strange consequences which I will tell. There's a bit of analytical work, partial equilibrium, and there are two papers, one by Lemon and Traeger came out in the American Economic Journal, Economic Policy, and there's a lot of stuff by Ken Judd and co-authors who use the DICE model and then they put these catastrophes in there. But it's fair to say, I think, that it's so numerical that you lose track of what the conceptual ideas are. And I'm trying to focus on these conceptual ideas, which I think may be in their simulations, but they're hidden among all the simulations. So really, the messages I'm going to say, I said, we're going to have the price carbon, so you're going to get the cost of carbon. We'll have an extra bit added to it to basically curb the risk of a catastrophe occurring. So you don't want to just price carbon to internalize the externalities Simon has just talked about, but you also want to price carbon to lower the hazard of a catastrophe occurring. So that's one, that's the first bullet. And the second bullet, next to the social cost of carbon, is something called the social benefit of capital. And the idea, of course, that if you have a certain catastrophe, it's more difficult to smooth consumption. So you want, in advance of it, you don't only want adaptation capital, but you want some extra precautionary capital accumulation to smooth consumption if and when the catastrophe occurs. So the model I'm going to give you is just a first year kind of graduate macro Ramsey model with a bit of fossil fuel chucked in so that we can actually write on the back of an envelope. So it's time sample utility function. Let me show it you here. You maximize the utility function, expected value utility function. We have some capital dynamics. That's your production function, depends on fossil fuel and renewables. That's the cost of fossil fuel and the cost of renewables. There's consumption, there's depreciation. There's the stock of CO2 in the atmosphere increases if you burn more fossil fuel. So there's the accumulation of that. And if you have bigger P for pollution, you have a bigger temperature. And then if you have a bigger temperature, then the hazard rate of that occurring will be higher, and the probability of a catastrophe occurring more quickly will be higher. So for the time being, I just assume that the total productivity is constant, but if a shock occurs, then there's a TFP shock. I can look at many other shocks. I'm just putting this here for expositional reasons. So that's the mathematical problem. So the way to solve that is very simply is you go by backward induction. So you first solve the post-catastrophe problem, and then you solve the pre-catastrophe problem. So the post-catastrophe problem is just a standard Ramsey model with some energy use. Let me not bore you with that. It will give you a value function for after the calamity, which depends on the size of the capital stock, and it might depend on the size of the disaster pi. More generally, it would depend on temperature of the pollution stock as well, but the way I've rigged it, it won't. It will in the second part of the paper. Then this is the problem I want you to look at. This is just a Bellman equation, or a Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation. And it's the thing you will remember is this utility of consumption. This is the marginal value of capital times K dot. This is the marginal value of the pollution stock times P dot. So the only new bit is this. So what happens is that you have to, there's a probability, a hazard H, which increases with temperature or pollution P, that a disaster occurs. And then this is actually a negative term because the value before the catastrophe will be higher than after the catastrophe. So that shows you that you switch, you tip to another regime with another value function. So really, we know what the after catastrophe value function is. We can solve this problem in the usual way. It will give us, for example, the normal kind of marginal utility as equal to the marginal value of capital. Marginal value of oil, if you want a fossil fuel, is the cost of fossil fuel plus the social cost of carbon, where the social cost of carbon is the emission coefficient times the marginal disutility of CO2 in the atmosphere divided by the marginal utility of capital. And that's it. So if you think about it, and then you always rederive something like the Euler equation, and you rederive something like the social cost of carbon equation, what they will look like is this. So what you will have here is an Euler equation, and this is the one most of you recognize, except you would have something like that. It's something like the rate of interest minus the rate of time preference times the elasticity of intertemporal substitution. So this is the new term being added. So really, you're really boosting the marginal product of capital. You're boosting the value of having extra capital accumulation. And that theta is proportional to the hazard of the catastrophe occurring. And it's, if you want, it is the bigger the potential drop in consumption after the catastrophe, the bigger the precautionary return on capital and the more capital accumulation you will do. Now, if you're a Minneapolis guy, then you will think that the market will take care of it itself, because they will internalize this probability of risk. If you don't, then it might require a capital subsidy. The social cost of carbon is in this particular story, this looks complicated, but really what it is not just the present, it's kind of the present value of expected damages, but it really doesn't depend on the hazard of it, it depends on the marginal hazard, because it depends on H prime, it depends by how much, by reducing P, by how much you reduce the hazard of a calamity occurring, the risk of a calamity occurring. And then of course it's proportional to the gap in value, by how much you lose out, which we can cut back out. And then the discount rate you use would, depending if you write it in resource units or in utility units, but would have to be augmented with this is the rate of decay of atmospheric carbon, that's the hazard rate, and in this particular case you'd have to add the precautionary return as well. So really, tau is, if you want, the social cost of carbon, it's the price of carbon the market will have to charge, and theta is, if you want, the precautionary return, or if you want the implicit capital subsidy, or whatever you want to call it. But I would argue that we need both theta and tau to really control, to allow for tipping, so to have an appropriate response. Now, of course, in practice, we may have lots of tipping points. They may be interacting and things like that. I won't talk about it now, so you can make it more complicated, but this is the basic insight. So just go back to this doomsday scenario. What many people assumed is that VA will be 0, and if that's the case, the discount effectively is like you're increasing the discount rate, because if that's the case, it's almost like this theta will be equal to -1, minus h. So it's like increasing rho from rho to rho plus h. That's what some of the literature does. So it's really like, do you remember this film of Mr. Bean? You've heard of Mr. Bean? He's got 1 minute to live, they tell him. So what is he doing at 1 minute? He wants to listen to all the Bach cantatas. He wants to see all the paintings by Francis Bacon. He wants to make love to all the women he's never made love to. And then he wants to eat all the wonderful Italian food you can possibly eat. Of course, at the end of the film, this 1 minute film, there's this doctor standing outside the House of Parliament. Mr. Bean, Mr. Bean. So he looks around and he crosses the road and he gets run over by a bus. The point is, that's the doomsday scenario. If you think you're going to die completely, you're going to have frantic consumption. Because we don't have that, it's the opposite. You're going to get the opposite. You get that precautionary capital accumulation. And that's what I'm trying to argue. So that's why the social benefit of capital is actually positive. So let's do an illustration. Let's calibrate a hazard function. The rest of the model is calibrated in fairly usual parameters in a kind of Mickey Mouse way, but it kind of mimics the type of numbers Simon and other people get out. So here is the carbon stock. I'm doing it in gigatons of carbon. You can do it in gigatons of CO2. As you said, it's 12 over 44, and then that's how you convert them. That's what I learned from my basic chemistry lessons. And here are two. This is a convex hazard function. This is a linear hazard function. So it's a quadratic and a linear. Why am I saying that? A lot of the climate scientists, like Lenton and all these guys, are talking a lot about how steep this hazard function rises. And some people say, if it's like, you say, like 3 degrees or 4 degrees, they say that all these catastrophes will be coming in boom, 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 boom. So that's almost like the hazard goes, oop, like that very much. So it matters, so it's nice to know how much that matters. So then what you see is, and then what I've done here is that the doubling of the carbon stock, which corresponds to 2.88 rise in temperature, the median figure for the diagram which Simon showed us, that leads to that brings forward the expected time of the calamity from 40 to 15 years. That's how I calibrate it. There's nothing scientific about it. I'm doing what you said. So I can give you the simulations, but I will give you the steady states of what I call prudent steady states. So first thing, if you look at the last two columns, these are the kind of policy instruments or whatever, the price of carbon and the precaution return. Of course, if you have a constant hazard rate, if the hazard doesn't depend on temperature, you wouldn't have a social cost of carbon in this. You wouldn't have an extra cost of carbon, because there's no way you can curb the risk of a calamity. So it's only if you have a hazard which depends on temperature or depends on pollution that you will actually have a price of carbon, 22 to 57, which is roughly the order of magnitude you talked about. Not by a coincidence. But you also have a precautionary return in terms of percentage per year. Now notice that if you have a bigger, the precautionary return is what's necessary to prevent it happening, because here the hazard is rising. The probability of a catastrophe is higher, so you have to do more precautionary capital accumulation. And that's why the capital stock rises quite a bit compared with the constant hazard rate or compared with business as usual. So you're really doing excess capital accumulation, if you want, to cover yourself, to soften the blow when it comes. So there is an interesting thing, of course. By doing that, you, in a sense, it's perfectly possible that you would actually use a bit more fossil fuel, because if capital and fossil fuel are corporate factors of production, which they typically are, then you would also use relatively more fossil fuel, despite you pricing it. So there's two ways, it could go two ways. So if you look at the diagrams, for example, just very simply, I just picked some. So I just said, well, let's imagine that there's a catastrophe happening here and one happening there. It's completely arbitrary. You could put it further down the line. And then giving you some illustrative simulations. Then you see that the capital stock, that there is actually an overaccumulation of the capital stock, and after the calamity, the economy moves to a lower state. This is like a 20% reduction in GTFP. Here you see the drops in consumption. Here's the calamity occurring. You go from boom to boom, boom to boom. And because you've got some extra capital accumulation, this shock is smaller than it would have been otherwise. 5, 1, 2, okay, 2 minutes. Thank you. And you see here the saving for the carbon stock, that you by pricing carbon, you manage to take it down. So, let me be quicker. let me do that not either. There is, let's look at this. So if you do the general case that you allow for productivity to depend on temperature as well, like in the Nordhaus model and like what Simon has done, then you would just get the top term. This is what they calculate. So that's really the marginal value of marginal damages. So that's the effect of temperature on productivity times output. That's F is output or GDP times the marginal of consumption. Then you get the discounted value of that. Notice it is not quite that because the discount rate you use of tipping is actually different to calculate the normal cost of carbon. And then you get, this is the one I had, and you get an extra term as an interaction term. So you can actually decompose the social cost of carbon in terms of its usual components and in terms of its catastrophe components. So when you look at that, and this will probably be the last slide then, well, let's just look at these things. Then you can actually split up the cost of carbon into these 3 bits. And if you want, if you don't do anything, the cost of carbon will be 15 ton per carbon. This is gigatons of CO2 now. Yeah? So that's why it looks a bit smaller. If you, after the shock, the social cost of carbon will be lower because the economy is operating at a low level of economic activity. So therefore there will be less fossil fuel use, and therefore there is less, the cost is less. Here you see that this is the normal, that this is, well, one thing is, if you compare that with that the naive solution, you price carbon, this is the normal Nordhaus price of carbon, and then you add an extra 40 with this calibration. So this is actually shows that it gives you the extra amount of, and if you have a quadratic hazard which rises more steeply and more convex, the extra top-up term on the social cost of carbon is higher. And you see that, of course, by having this potential of a tip, you need to ensure that there's enough precautionary capital accumulation, so there's an implicit precautionary return there, which is actually leading to this extra, a lot of extra. Compare that with that. That's Nordhaus. This is with tipping. That there's a lot of extra capital accumulation going on to basically be prepared for when the shock comes. So I think you can have lots of other catastrophes. So you can have, because Simon mentioned that in his talk, he had climate sensitivity that could be very high. And we don't really know what's happening in that fat tail. So you could do a shock, a potential catastrophe in climate sensitivity. So you look at carbon catastrophes, you could look at more catastrophes in the cycle of the carbon cycle. You could allow for positive feedback, suddenly unleashing positive feedback. And you find that actually when you try to put reasonable numbers to that most of these effects are quite positive. So the only reason why I wanted to talk a bit about this here is that it's a bit of an antidote to the normal kind of gradual damages, Pigouvian externality thing. Because really the Nordhaus model is just calculating a Pigouvian externality. That's basically what it is. And saying that there are ways of doing uncertainty like Gollier does, and where we just try to find, and Weitzman try to find all these distributions, but a large number of people in the field are beginning to look about tipping and these hazards of things like that. So there's a lot of work there with climate scientists, particularly on how to calibrate it. Thank you.
Thank you. One or two questions. One up there.
I was just
sorry, could you wait for the mic?
So I was just wondering how sort of literal you want to take this finding that you want to accumulate capital more strongly when you have this disaster risk, because it seems to me that this seems to come from the ability of the accumulation of capital to support consumption smoothing. But surely, at least in sort of disaster risk, if the shock to consumption is large, with irreversible investment, you can't eat over bridges or railways or anything else. So it seems to me that irreversible investment would really just speak to having a higher carbon tax ex ante and not distribute the way to mitigate the risk between capital accumulation and a higher tax. So I guess you would have less capital accumulation subsidy and a higher carbon tax if you thought investment was irreversible.
Okay, in my case, investment is perfectly flexible, but I have looked at the case where you have adjustment costs. I haven't looked at the irreversible sense in the sense of like the Pindag-Dixit thing, but I can imagine that, and you would hesitate a bit. But that's with any type of investment. But even so, that might mitigate it a bit. Related to your point is the idea that this is kind of mitigation capital, but you also have adaptation capital. So there's also, I always think of it like two types of capital. This is general kind of capital to smooth consumption. But there's also like being half Dutch. There's also a lot of stuff like building water defenses, dikes and things like that, where a lot of people in Rotterdam earn a living, which just, you know, jumps up and down with this type of capital accumulation and jumps up and down with the carbon tax. So I think in practice you would allow for both of these. So this irreversibility, I think, is an element, but it's just an offsetting element.
Okay, we've got time for one further short question. Anyone has one? Okay, we have one front here.
So to what extent do you...
Sorry, Harry, could you just wait for the end of mine? Thanks.
Does it work? Okay, so I was just wondering to what extent you believe that the market can take care of this precautionary motive?
Well, all the people, I have a lot of friends in the profession who all believe that the market will take care of it. I don't believe it. So if I ask Per Cruzel or John Hassler, all these macro type of guys, they would say, well, the market will take. And of course you will write it, and if you write down the paper, the market will take it. But I still have a nagging feeling that the market wouldn't take care enough of it. There are too many, well, one, the risks are that large. The question is whether there be credit market failures, to actually, whether actually countries will have to do a large part of it. A large part are public damages. So I think in practice, I mean, the lesson is there has to be extra precautionary capital accumulation. Part of it can be done by the private sector, but it probably won't be enough. If you ask me why, I don't know, but it's my hunch.
All right, well, okay, thank you so much. Rick.
Thank you.
So on to our final talk of the evening. So our next presenter is Professor Ottmar Edenhofer. Ottmar is
why finance minister?
Several titles, including Professor of the Economics of Climate Change at the Technical University of Berlin and Deputy Director and Chief Economist of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. One of the things that I'm not sure if you know about Ottmar is he's actually been a leading figure, and I mean seriously a leading figure, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for many years. So now there are several thousand people in the world who go around claiming they have a Nobel Prize by dint of association with the IPCC, but Ottmar actually has a much more reasonable claim to that title than almost any of them, because he's actually a co-chair of Working Group 3. So his talk on, well, you can see the title here, is sort of bringing us more into the policy realm. So Rick and I have done our sort of varying degrees of modelling of climate impacts, and I think Ottmar is going to sort of bring us back into thinking about the practicalities of reducing emissions. So Ottmar, thank you for coming. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. And it's very nice not to be here as a co-chair of IPCC, because I will use this next 20 minutes to be a free man and express my own opinions about the whole stuff. And I'm coming from a climate impact research, but in my talk I do not care about the climate impacts, neither about gradual damages or catastrophe damages. So I would like to ask the question, have finance ministers any incentive to impose carbon taxes even he or she is not interested in climate change at all? So let me start with the motivation. So basically, for this talk, this is my take on the climate problem. So basically, whatever you calculate, the optimal cumulative amount of carbon which can be released into the atmosphere is between, let's say, 900 and 1,200 gigatons CO2. But the problem is that we have much more fossil fuels underground. And the crucial thing is, so what can we do to incentivize people or even to force people that the vast majority of fossil fuels will remain underground in the future? And I see basically three possibilities. The first one is believing in a miracle. And the miracle is technological change. For example, the levelized costs of electricity of wind might be so low that nobody has any incentive to use coal in the electricity sector. I have to say, I believe that miracle happens, but I would not rely on this miracle. The second possibility is we could compensate the owners of fossil fuels for remaining the fossil fuels underground. So this has some distributional implications which probably not everybody would like to accept. And then the second aspect is, or the third possibility is, so we impose a price on carbon like a carbon tax. Just to remind you, so for a 2-degree target, which is basically now negotiated internationally, 80% of coal, 40% of gas, and 40% of oil have to remain underground. So that is just the order of magnitude. So I do not see any institution emerging very soon, like a world government, which could implement such a policy. And therefore, I ask the question, so what about the finance ministers? We have in the negotiations so many environmental ministers, but is there any incentive for them? And I thought it might be useful to think about this issue in the terms of a globalization paradox, which has been put forward by Danny Roderick. And basically, he argues that you can either have national sovereignty or democracy, but not hyperglobalization. So you can only reconcile both of these components of globalization, but not 3 of them. And to be a little bit more precise, I would argue that basically governments are embedded in a global capital market. Capital is mobile. And if this is the case, so there is an issue of tax competition, capital tax competition. And this capital tax competition undermines infrastructure investments or investments in domestic public goods. So even if people want to have national public goods, either because of their preferences or because they are quite productive for the economies, so this cannot be carried out because of the tax competition issue. And this is what we observe even in Europe, so we have declining tax rates on capital. And my question in this talk is there any possibility to use the carbon taxes to deal with this globalization paradox in the sense that carbon taxes could help us to finance public infrastructure without being involved in a tax competition like in the capital tax competition? So this is my question here. And just for the motivation, just to give you a flavor, so what we have done so far, we have tried to calculate the infrastructure investments. So infrastructure investment in the sense if we want to have universal access to electricity, to clean water, to sanitation, to telecommunication services and roads. And here we try to calculate if we use all the resource rents, so how much can we finance of this infrastructure needs? So if you have here 1, this basically means that the infrastructure costs can be covered by the carbon tax rents. And if it is larger than 1, so the infrastructure costs are larger and it cannot be covered by the tax rates. And you see some of the countries you can cover all these investments, some countries you cannot. If you add to this resource rent taxation carbon pricing, so then this looks much more favorable. So my research questions are basically the following. Most economists agree on carbon pricing to address the climate externality, and many prefer taxes. But what is the role of a carbon tax under the assumption that no climate externality exists? However, can carbon taxes finance infrastructure more efficiently than capital taxes, consumption taxes, and labor taxes when input factors like capital and resources are mobile? And what are the supply side dynamics when resource importing countries, for the resource importing countries, and also what are the implications for the accumulative amount of emissions? So before I go into the details of the model, I would like to highlight the most important results of my paper, or of our paper. First, in a Nash equilibrium, a carbon tax is much more efficient than a capital tax. Both taxes, the capital tax and the carbon tax, are subject to the race to the bottom. However, the most important advantage of the carbon taxes it captures part of the hoteling rent and has intertemporally no distortion effects on capital accumulation. The second important component is there is no green paradox. Why? Because if we tax all the carbon rents away, the demand side fully determines the extraction, and the demand side is basically driven by the investment in the domestic public goods. And the carbon taxes has the potential in postponing the extraction, in contrast what people, or what Hans-Werner Sinn in his green paradox claims, and it reduces even the cumulative emissions. It has not just a postponement effect, but also a volume effect. And both results are robust under different strategic settings, when importers are cooperating or when exporters behave strategically or non-strategically. So let me explain a little bit the model setup. The model setup is basically a two-level game. So in the first game, we have basically households, and the households provide capital and labor on the market, and they get a return on investment. And here we have a government. The government finances the domestic public good, and it can impose taxes, labor taxes, consumption taxes, capital taxes, and resource taxes. So this is one level. And the households are basically normally intertemporal optimizing households. We have then a quite static firm, and we have also an intertemporal optimizing government. The government is benevolent in the sense it has the same utility function than the representative household, but the government optimizes basically the capital, the resource, the consumption, and the labor taxes. So this is one level. So basically we have a three-country model, and the countries are basically operating on an international resource market and also on an international mobile capital market. And basically in the resource market, it's supply and demand is equalized. The resource exporting countries behave like a hoteling supplier. And also we have an international mobile capital market, and again, we have here the usual market clearing conditions. So basically, I said that we have a two-level game. Domestically, the government is the Stackelberg leader. As a Stackelberg leader, it takes into account the reaction functions from the households and from the firms. And at an international level, they simultaneously behave as Nash players. And basically, these are the Nash equilibrium and the two subgames. And we have basically two scenarios, a non-cooperative scenario where we calculate the Nash behavior and also the cooperative behavior of the governments. But I have to say that this cooperative behavior is obviously not a Nash equilibrium, because so there is no way to get rid of, at least in this model, of the free rider problem. But the question was from the very beginning on, so is there any positive effect on the environment and also on the welfare, even if we have no cooperation and if we just can see and observe a Nash equilibrium? So let me highlight a few of my results here. First, so this is a complicated model, therefore we have carried out a numeric solution due to the high complexity. And the calibration has been carried out in the following way. We had basically two symmetric countries to avoid the results are driven by just asymmetries. And the flexibility of the modeling framework allows for a calibration to setups with very specific regions like US and the EU. So what we have done is basically first to calculate the single instrument portfolio. Here we have assumed that the governments just impose a resource tax, a labor tax, a consumption tax, or a capital tax. In the next stage, we will solve this simultaneously, where the government can choose the optimal mix of all these taxes. What you can see here is even at this level, the importer countries have a higher consumption if they just impose a resource tax, and they have the lower consumption if they impose a tax on capital income. And this is mirrored basically by the exporters' profits. So the profits of the exporters are reduced significantly if the importers impose a carbon tax, and the profits are highest when the importers impose a consumption tax. So then, now let's move on to the mixed portfolio. Basically, we have here the combination of the consumption taxes and the labor taxes, and here we focus now on the optimal combination of the resource tax and on the capital tax. The first important insight is, if there is a combination of a capital tax and a CO2 tax or resource tax is imposed on the system, so then we have an immediate a significant volume effect on emissions. So this is the most important thing, because the governments have an incentive to impose a tax, and on the other hand, the exporting countries have no way to speed up the extraction. And here you can see the timing and the volume effect. There's a significant volume effect if both components, if both taxes, the capital tax and the resource tax, is here imposed on the system. So there is no green paradox. Why? Because it can be shown the green paradox can be avoided when the resource tax has a lower growth rate than the interest rate. And this is the case in this model. And therefore, under such conditions, there is basically no incentive to speed up the extraction. And even if you have a significant high initial value of the carbon tax, so then you can also gain a volume effect on the whole system. So one important aspect on the volume effect is, and also on the welfare, is to what extent the exporters can behave strategically. What you can see here is, on the one hand, if the exporters can behave strategically, so then the net present value of the consumption of the importing countries will be much lower. But on the other way around, or the opposite effect is on the cumulative amount of emissions. If the exporting countries can behave strategically, so then there is, because they will increase the price significantly, and therefore they reduce the cumulative amount of emissions. A portfolio which includes the carbon tax yields a higher net present value of consumption in importing countries, and this finding is independent of whether the exporter may interact strategically or not. However, if you have the potential of the exporter behaves strategically, so this will reduce the net present value. Let me summarize my results. First, the carbon tax is more efficient than the capital tax because of the asymmetry between the capital and the carbon as a tax base, and only the resource stock gives rise to rent and capture the rent. This is the basic advantage of this carbon taxation. Carbon taxes delays extraction, reduces the cumulative emissions, and the timing of the infrastructure demand fully determines the supply side dynamics. And these results are robust under different sorts of strategic behavior, in particular the strategic behavior of the exporters. Now, what are the tentative policy conclusions? First, carbon pricing can help to mitigate the race to the bottom. The supply side dynamics of carbon pricing matters but pose no environmental problems. And we could rethink the role of environmental policy. So the environmental ministers might be very much interested on the climate damages, but not the finance ministers. But the finance ministers could also have a strong impact on the volume of emissions, and therefore I would argue first we should talk to the finance ministers, because the environmental ministers in Paris next year would have a much easier job. Thanks.
Time for questions? Okay, we've got one gentleman here.
Yeah, so just trying to think how this fits with normal optimal tax theory, which would say that you'd have a consumption tax as a more efficient tax than a tax on capital, and isn't subject to the race to the bottom. I'm not sure how your results would change if you incorporate that into the model, whether it's something to do with the fact that there's these rents from the extracting of the natural resources.
Yeah, so we have included the consumption tax, And the consumption tax does not change the issue, because if you have the CO2 tax or the rent tax, so then you can capture the rent, and this is increases the efficiency of the rent tax, and this is not will not be changed if you include a consumption tax.
Well, thank you for a very thought-provoking paper. I had a similar question, so I will stick away from it. But normally, I mean, there is a literature on tax on this extraction from no telling rents. A lot of this in the Canadian Journal of Economics, but I'll give you those references, and also on the games on Nash versus Cooperative. But of course, it would also induce a reaction. I mean, these guys, if you try to pluck those geese who produce the oil, they will probably try to clobber us back. So they will try to capture some of the climate rent. So in a more general context, I think your model, you would have a carbon tax would be set higher than the Pigouvian tax, because there would be kind of a rent extraction term on top, which is what you've talked about. But of course, the oil barons won't let it happen, so they will change their oil prices. So there is this game where they try to get our climate rents and we try to get their and then that would probably nuance your results.
But this we have included.
We have it in here.
We have so this was basically when the exporting countries can behave strategically, but this has an even stronger effect. It has a negative effect on the welfare of the importing countries, but it has a very positive effect on the volume effect of emissions, because they will increase then the price. Yeah. So, and this has a stronger volume effect.
And do you have in your model, is the total amount of oil to be extracted is endogenous, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's totally determined endogenously.
Okay, so you passed your Van der Ploeg MOT there. Any more questions?
But let me say one thing is, it's the potential for strategic behavior of the oil exporting countries is so important that in the end this has an impact of a few hundred gigatons of cumulative emissions. So that this is the most important driving force. But it's good if they can behave strategically, right? From a purely environmental point of view. It's bad from a welfare economics point of view for the importing countries.
Okay, so the final question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, I was wondering if these taxes is optimal for the exporter as well, like for the exporting countries, the people like countries who are exporting the, let's say, natural resources. Is the carbon tax optimal for them as well?
No, it's a game. It's a Nash equilibrium, but all countries, the exporting countries and the two importing countries, optimize their taxes, but in the end they end up in a Nash equilibrium. So they could do better if they cooperate, but there's always an incentive for free riding, right?
And taking into account maybe it's not that related, but the political economy of the, I don't know, the exporting countries, we know that reaching an agreement because of the fight that is going on, maybe is very impossible to see an agreement from that side of the story.
If all of them behave strategically and are able to cooperate against the importing countries, this is exactly what I said, then they behave strategically, and this is an even stronger effect on the cumulative amount of emissions or the extracted resources, and has a strong impact on the welfare of the importing countries. So they can reduce the welfare of the importing countries, but at the same time, so they reduce the cumulative amount of emissions.
Thank you.